Today's date is April 13th, 2005. We're here at the Warhawk Air Museum in Nampa, Idaho, as part of the Veterans History Project. Today we're interviewing Jack Rencher as part of the Veterans History Project in partnership with the Library of Congress. My name is James Turner, and I will be conducting this interview today. Also present in the room is John Hubbard. He's our cameraman and director. Jack, welcome to the Warhawk History Museum, and if you wouldn't mind, please give us your full name, address, and birth date.
My name is Jack P. Rencher. I kid a lot and say the P stands for poor or poverty-stricken, but really it says Preston. And it's kind of an old family Rencher name. There's several of them with Preston. My address is 2901 in Hill Road, Boise, Idaho. And what else did you want to know?
And what branch of the service did you serve in and when?
I served in the U.S. Army Air Corps from shortly after Pearl Harbor in '42 until, probably, I don't remember the dates, but probably 1946, 47, right in there someplace. A lot of the fellows remember the dates, but I don't.
Okay. Again, Jack, I just want to thank you for coming into the Warhawk today. It says here that you served in the 303rd Bomb Group, the 358th Squadron, the U.S. Army Air Corps. Can you, first off, why don't you describe where you were from in the States?
I grew up in northern Arizona. My father was a forest ranger, and we lived 52 miles from Globe, Arizona, way out, just out in the country in a ranger station. And so I had nobody to play with except an Airedale dog named Pal. And so I never learned to talk very plain. I could bark real good with the dog. If my folks wanted to find me, I'd be out in the woods looking for a skunk or a squirrel or something, and they'd call the dog, and he wouldn't come, but he'd bark, so they knew where I was. And I grew up that way. When I got to be 6 years old and was supposed to go to school, my folks moved to a little town in northern Arizona called Eager, and my grandfather lived there, and I had an uncle and aunt that lived there, so I had some cousins, and so I went to school there till I was in the 6th grade. And when I was in the 6th grade, my mother was a school teacher, and we went to Flagstaff so she could go to summer school or school there and get a little better degree. I think you had to go to school ever so often to keep your teaching degree. So I went to Flagstaff to school for a little bit, and then my dad went to work for the Fish and Game in Idaho as a game warden, and we lived in an old abandoned fish hatchery in a very small town called Greer. And Greer had a one-room schoolhouse and one teacher for the 8th grades. I was in the 7th grade. There was nobody in the 8th grade. There was nobody in the 6th grade, and I was the only one in the 7th grade. So it ended up that I taught the 1st and 2nd grade, and Mrs. Wignall, the teacher, taught the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. And so we did pretty good, and my 1st and 2nd graders did pretty darn well that I taught. My dad went to Phoenix, Arizona, and I went to Phoenix and went to Osborne School in Phoenix in the 8th grade. And then I started high school at Phoenix Union High School. I had a paper out with the Arizona Republic, and I delivered telegrams on a bicycle at night for Western Union. And after my 8th grade there, my folks moved back to the mountains up in this little town of Eager. And I had a good little job delivering papers in Western Union, and I made $35 or $40 a month. And so I didn't go back with them. I stayed there. And so I went to Phoenix Union High School my freshman year. I took ROTC, not because I was military-minded, but because they furnished uniforms, and I didn't have much money to buy clothes with, so I wore ROTC uniforms that they furnished, and that's why I got in the ROTC. And I went there my first year, and my second year, I was working for, I was delivering papers every morning and every night after school, and then in the evening I delivered telegrams for Western Union. Now in those days we didn't have email and things, so lots of telegrams went out. I'd ride my bicycle probably 50, 60 miles every night delivering telegrams, and I'd usually get through about 1:30 in the morning. And so then I'd go out where I stayed and sleep, and I had to be at school at 9 o'clock. Phoenix Union High School was a big high school, had probably 5,000 students. And they ran in two shifts. Half of them started at 8 and got out at around 3, and half of them started at 9 and got out at around 4. So when I was working those hours, I didn't get to bed probably till 2, so making an 8 o'clock class was kind of rough. So I'd come in at 9 and stay till 4, and then I'd go to work for Western Union. I'd deliver my papers for the Phoenix Gazette and then go to work for Western Union. So my second year, they wanted me to come in at 8 o'clock. And I told them, no, I don't get to bed till 1:30, 2, 3 o'clock, and I can't make an 8 o'clock class. And they said, well, that's too bad, but we can't change you. And I said, look, guys, I said, you've got kids coming here in a chauffeur-driven limousine, and you let them come at 9, and I have to work to go to school. And they wouldn't change it anyway, so I just skipped the 8 o'clock class. So pretty soon I got 17 half a demerits or something, and I got called in because I was absent for that class. And so they sent me over to see a fellow named Dr. Eastburn or Dr. Westburn, something, I don't remember his name. And I was quite strong and physical because I did physical exercise riding that bicycle. And so I go to see Dr. Eastburn or Dr. Westburn, and to me a doctor was a medical doctor. So he was sitting behind his desk, and he said, he was kind of nasty to me, and he said, what do you want to be when you grow up? You going to live off your folks all your life? You just going to be a bum? And I said to him, I don't know what I'm going to be, but I'm not going to be a lousy school teacher that calls himself a doctor. And he got up and he came around and he got me the collar and he said, you can't talk to me like that. And I said, turn me loose, you old goat. And he didn't, and so I slugged him. And I missed his jaw because he was shaking. I hit him up the side of the head, and it just knocked him flat on the floor. And he crawled on his hands and knees to the door and jumped up and ran out. And he was gone, so I just left and went back to class. And the next day, Dr. Montgomery called me in. He was the superintendent. And so he had all my school records my freshman year out there, and he said, Jack, he said, last year you were never absent and you was never tardy, and you had straight A's on your report cards. And he said, here this year, look what a mess you're in. And he said, I know that something happened. And he said, but I can't let you hit the teachers and not do something about it. He said, I'm going to suspend you for a week, and I want you to go around to all your teachers and get your assignment, and whatever's wrong in your life, I want you to straighten it out and come back next week and be a student like you were last year. And I said, well, there's nothing I can do to straighten it out. If the schools can't straighten it out, I can't either. So if you suspend me, I'm not coming back. So he suspended me, and I didn't go back. So anyway, for the next this is during the Depression in the early 30s, and things were rough. And so I worked wherever I could find a job. I worked for farmers when they were busy baling hay or something. I worked for the Forest Service when they had a fire. And if I could find a road construction job, why, I'd work on it till, if I could get a job till the contract was over, and then I was unemployed again, and I was kind of homeless. If it rained, I found a schoolhouse and slept on the porch on the cement under the awning. And if I was out in the woods, why, I could fish and shoot a squirrel or a rabbit or go catch a perch. And so I ate, and I had a little .22 that I could shoot a dove or a pigeon or a squirrel or a rabbit. And so I was really never very hungry, but I was quite homeless. And in the winter time, why, I'd stay down in the valley around Phoenix, Mesa, Tucson, Scottsdale, and hunt for jobs down there and scrounge around as best I could. And in the summertime, I'd go up in the White Mountains, and up there, I'd find a job. I'd chop wood for people or do temporary work, whatever I could find. And this went on for roughly about 2 years. And if I ever got ahead a little bit, down in Phoenix, I could take flying lessons for $6 an hour. And I never ever had $6, but sometimes I had $2, so I could fly for 20 minutes. And so every once in a while, if I was a little flush, I'd go down and I'd hitchhike everywhere I went. I never rode the railroad cars like a lot of guys did, but I'd go down there and take a flying lesson at Phoenix. And so I flew Aeronica C2s and C3s a little bit, and a little airplane called a monoprep that nobody ever heard of. And then I'd go down there on weekends, and if somebody was washing their airplane or sweeping out the hangar, why, I'd help them, and oftentimes when they'd test fly the airplane, they'd give me a ride. So anyway, I started out flying probably in 1937 when I was 16 years old, and I never did get much time because I was poor. And a lot of the times, why, nearly every weekend, if I helped somebody sweep out their hangar or wash their airplane, why, they'd give me a ride, you see, but it was probably some amateur pilot that I shouldn't even been flying with, but he'd let me fly it a little bit. And once in a great while, the little Aeronica C2s or C3s, they'd let me land or take off. And so I got a little bit of time. And so anyway, along, let's see, probably about 1939, Pearl Harbor was in 41, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was about early in 1939. I got a job with Phelps Dodge Corporation in Morenci, Arizona, and it was an open pit copper mine. And I went down there, and it was just luck I got on. I won't bore you with how, but anyway, I got on as a job greasing trucks, and it paid $4.13 a day. And that was the most money I'd ever seen in my life. And it was a steady job. It wasn't just temporary. So I started out refueling trucks and greasing trucks, and I got so I could drive the trucks on and off the grease rack. And so I hit the truck foreman up for job driving truck, and they transferred me to become a truck driver. And one night my truck broke down. I worked graveyard, so I could go to night school from 6 till 10. Yeah, those were the hours. And then I'd go to work at 11 and work graveyard. And I worked straight graveyard so I could go to that school. And if you were going to swing shift, which was from 3 to 11, you couldn't go to that night school. So you either had to work straight days or straight graveyard. So I worked straight graveyard because the guys I traded with didn't want to work graveyard. So they'd just swap. Am I taking too long? They'd just swap between days and swing, and they liked that, and I took straight graveyard. So anyway, while I was driving the trucks one night, these were 5-yard dump trucks, and one night my truck broke down, and I took it into the shop to get it fixed. And so instead of standing around while the mechanic fixed it, I helped him. So the shop foreman asked the truck foreman, he said, when you have a truck breakdown, he said, take Rencher's truck and let Rencher bring the broken down truck into the shop. And my foreman said, why? And he said, well, because he helps us and we're short of mechanics. And so the other truck drivers just stand around. So anyway, I started taking all the broken down trucks into the shop, and so the truck foreman, or the shop foreman, asked me if I'd transfer over there, and he made me a mechanic B. And so, so I went to work there as a mechanic B, and I worked there a few months, and I got promoted to a mechanic A. So I was in heaven. I was making $6 or $8 a day, and I loved being a mechanic. I bought some tools, and we had a cat shop right up the hill. It wasn't on the second floor; it was just up a hill. Everything in them, and there was built on a hillside. So one night, the cat foreman came down to the truck foreman. And he said his name was Jimmy Fernandez, great guy. And he said, Jimmy, he said, I've got cats broken down all over the place. Can you loan me 2 or 3 mechanics for a week or two? And so Jimmy Fernandez said, would I like to go up and be a cat mechanic? And I told him, sure, I'd like to do that. So I went up and started working on the Caterpillars, tractors. They were D8 Caterpillar tractors with bulldozers on the front and a big heavy winch on the back. They weighed 57 tons, so they weren't little. And so anyway, I worked on them a while, and we had a service truck that went out into the pit. This pit was probably 6 or 7 miles all around it. And we had this service truck, and they kept 2 men on that service truck. So if a cat broke down, you'd go out to where it was broken and fix it. And I got on that service truck, and so every time we'd get a cat all fixed, if I didn't have a call to go to another, and I'd say to the cat skinner, why don't you let me road test this for a few minutes and be sure everything's working good. And they always enjoyed the rest, so I got on it and pushed the dirt around a while. Whatever job they was doing, I did it. And I got so I could run a cat pretty good. And so I got transferred to becoming cat skinner in a few months, and that was the second highest pay in the pit. And I got around $15 a day, and I was delighted. And that's what I did until Pearl Harbor. Now, I must tell you, back up a little bit, before I went to work for the mine, the government had a job called CMTC, Citizens Military Training Corps. And every July you would go to Fort Bliss, Texas and train with the Army for 1 month. They didn't pay you anything, but you got your uniforms and your board and room, and they paid you 5 cents a mile to go down there and then back home. Well, I couldn't find a job. That 5 cents a mile from where I lived in Arizona to Fort Bliss, Texas was more than I could earn working. So in July, I'd quit whatever I was doing and go to Fort Bliss. And so I became a horse cavalryman in the horse 7th Cavalry, or maybe it's the 8th, I don't remember. But anyway, we rode horses and cleaned out their eyes, nostrils, and docked. And we rode all over the desert and practiced cavalry warfare with the Army. And I didn't know this, but I was in the reserves. So right after Pearl Harbor, I get a telegram that I'm to report to my unit, 7th Cavalry in Fort Bliss, Texas, and that this telegram would authorize any public transportation to give me a ride down there at government expense. Well, I never got that telegram. I thought, man, if I've got to fight a war, I don't want to look after a horse. So, and clean out their eyes, nostrils, and dock. And I kind of like horses, all right. Some of my best friends are parts of horses. But anyway, I had an old car then. I got in my car and I quit my job. Got in my car and went to Phoenix, Arizona, and went into the Army recruiting office and told him I wanted to enlist in the cadet program and join the Army. And
at that time, Jack, did you think you wanted to go into the Army Air Corps?
I wanted in the Army Air Corps, yeah.
Okay. So did you have a choice when you went into the office?
Well, no, not quite. After I tried to join this Army, I'd read about all this. I read all the time. And so I knew they had a program, this Army Air Corps program, but if you had to have 2 years of college or take a test. And this sergeant that was a recruiting officer there, when I told him what I wanted to do, he said, you just will enlist. He said, there's no chance you can get in the pilot program without 2 years of college. And I said, well, there's a test you can take. Oh, yeah, there is, but he said nobody can pass that test. And so he spent about 30 minutes trying to get me to enlist. And I said, no, if I can't enlist in the cadet program, I'm going to go see the Navy and see if they'll take me. So he finally said, all right, I'll sign you up for the test, but he said, it's just hopeless. He said, you can't pass it. And then he looked in my mouth and he said, you can't pass the physical, your teeth don't fit or something. He got an overbite or an underbite, I don't know what. But anyway, I enlisted in it. And I had to wait about 2 weeks before they gave this test. And so I hung around Phoenix. I had a friend there to let me sleep with him in their house, a fellow named Elbert Morris. And I'd met him in my travels. And so anyway, I stayed there for about 2 weeks, and I took the test. And there's about 140 of us took it, and 2 of us passed it. And the test wasn't rough for me because I had read a lot, and a lot of it was on current events. Who's the Secretary of Agriculture, and who's the Secretary of this or that, and what happened here and what happened there. And I read Time or magazines like that all the time, and I had a good memory. So I passed the test, and so anyway, I got in the cadet program. And when I went through the dentist in the physical, I was real worried about my teeth. And there's about 200 of us, and we was all just naked as jaybirds going through this physical. And here's 5 or 6 dentists looking. This old dentist looked in my mouth and pushed his mirror around, and oh, I was scared. Here's where I get washed out. And he said to the dentist right next to him, he said, "Joe, come and look in this guy's mouth." And I thought, oh, gad, I'm gone. So Joe came over with his little mirror, and he looked in there, and he said, "I'll be damned." Went back to his patient, and I said, this dentist, I said, "Doctor, what's the matter with my teeth?" He said, "You're the first guy we've had that never had any dental work and didn't need any." And I nearly fell out of the chair. But anyway, I got through that. And so anyway, I went through classification where we had to take a bunch of psychological and mental tests to see what you were fit for. And you could either become a pilot, navigator, bombardier, or air crew, depending on how you did on all these tests. And I kind of cheated. Some of these tests, like one of them, you held a little rod in a little hole about that big, and every time it touched the edge of that hole, it made a horrible squawk. And so while you were holding this in there, while there's some sergeant there just raising hell with you, threatening you with everything, and see how much you'd shake. See, and I figured everybody's got to shake with that little rod in that hole. So I figured what they're interested in is when you're under pressure, how much more do you shake than when you're not. So when I wasn't under pressure, I just shook hell out of it. And when I was under pressure, why, I killed Shep the same way. And so I passed that one. And then they had another test where to test your reflexes. And well, I shouldn't put this on tape because they'll kick me out of but it's too late now. I'm already out. But they had another test where they had you put your foot on a thing like a throttle, and it turned the light on. And so then when the light came on, you had to take your foot off the throttle and put it on a brake. And when you put the foot on the brake, the light went off. And they tested how long it took that light to go off before you had the brake on. No, the light came on, and when the light came on, you put on the brake. So anyway, I watched that thing for a minute and was watching this light, and back in just behind it, I see a little stopwatch, and I see a little lever that pushes a switch. And I thought that little lever is what runs that light. So I didn't pay any attention to that light. When that little lever started moving, I slammed on the brake. And they said, they came and checked it. They said, something's got to be wrong here. Nobody's got that flash of reflexes. And they checked it 2 or 3 times and had to do me over. And so instead of taking 1/10 of a second, I was taking 100th of a second. Sometimes I nearly beat that dang light, see, because I watched that little switch, and when it started down, boy, I went for the brake. So anyway, I cheated to pass that test. But anyway, I think I could have passed it anyway. But then anyway, they had another test with depth perception, and they had 2 little rods sticking up on a rope. And when you pulled these ropes, these little rods moved back and forth. And these little rods were, probably 20 feet from you, and in a kind of a little tube, so you could see them. But they had 2 ropes to them. So when I was watching the guys ahead of me take that test, I studied the ropes, and I found some little frazzles and some little dirty places on it. And I could kind of see them from an angle, so I looked to see where those little dirty places were when the little rods were lined up. And so what I'd do, when it came my turn, he'd pull this out, and I'll get them parallel. So I'd pull them till they looked parallel, and then I'd check those dirty places on the rope that were right in your hands, see, so I could kind of check it. So I passed that test too. So I think I could have passed it without it. But anyway, I got through, and I got qualified as a pilot, navigator, or bombardier. And so I chose to go to pilot school.
Where did you go to pilot school?
My first, I had pre-flight at Santa Ana. And pre-flight was, we took a lot of, no, we weren't flying, we took ground school and a little bit of navigation theory and fuel and lubrication and the parts of the airplane and how the internal engine combustion worked, and 8 or 10 courses, and one of them was Morse code and physics. And I had, see, most of these guys were college boys, and I was just a 2-year high school boy. So we had double bunks, and I had, as my freshman year in high school, a teacher named H.H. Turner that taught general science, and I owe a great deal to him because I learned a lot of science from that man, physics and chemistry and biology, and just general science course. But anyway, physics was kind of difficult for me in a way, and Morse code was. And the other subjects, I barreled right through them. But we had, I think, I don't remember for sure, but I think the pilots had to do 8 words a minute. The radio operators needed to do 12, and if you worked for Western Union, you probably ought to be 60 or 70. But anyway, I was having trouble with my code, and I was on the 4-word a minute table, and I couldn't take it. And we had to get up to 8 words a minute, and we only had 9 weeks to do it. And so anyway, there was a fellow there that had worked for Western Union, and with a typewriter, he could probably take 100 words a minute. And I told him one time, I said, boy, I'm going to flunk out. I've only got 2 more weeks, and I'm having trouble with 6 words a minute. He said, Rencher, I'm going to tell you something. He said, forget that 6 words a minute. You get on the 16 words a minute table and stay on it a week. And so I got on it, and I said, I'm not getting half of it. And he said, just do the best you can. Just stay on it for a week. And when your week's over, come back and see me. And he was another cadet. So I stayed on it for a week, and he said, now I want you to go back to the 12-word a minute table. I went back to 12 words a minute, and I could take 12 words a minute and read a Reader's Digest while I was doing it. See, what I was doing, I was trying to count the dits and the daws. When you get up where it's faster, it becomes a sound. If it says da-de-da, why then you heard it like somebody saying B to you. It was a word instead of a dit and a da. And so heck, it was nothing. So I passed that. And then on my physics, we had lights out at 10, and so we could do our homework till 10 o'clock, and we had to turn the lights out. And I slept in a lower bunk, and my friend Thomas A. Worsham had the upper bunk above me. So when we had lights out, every day I'd go to the PX, and I'd buy 2 flashlight batteries for a nickel apiece, and at 10 o'clock I'd stuff the blankets into his bed, and I'd get in my little tent where they couldn't see the lights, and I'd study my physics with the flashlight till my batteries went dead. So I used a set of batteries every night to study the physics. And so anyway, I'm going to brag a little bit. In our physics test, we had the teacher teaching us was a civilian, and he had about over 100 students in his class, and he just taught one class right after another. And so anyway, we had a test at 3 weeks and 6 weeks, and then we had the final at 9 weeks. And the day after our final, he was up there reading the scores alphabetically, and if you didn't get a 70, you was washed out, or better. And so when he got down to Rencher, instead of reading the score, he said, Rencher, would you stand up, please? And he didn't know where anybody was. See, he just, if there's a vacant seat, he'd look on his chart and mark them absent. So he didn't know anybody personally. So I stood up, and he said, Rencher, he said, I've been teaching this class for 2 years, and you're the first person we've ever had that got 100 on all the tests. How did you do it, Rencher? And I said, sir, I copied off the man in front of me. And I felt real bad about that because I found out the man in front of me flunked. But anyway, I did get through the physics real good. And so anyway, I went through pilot school. We went out of pre-flight. They sent me to Santa Ana, California. And this was a lucky break. I had a lot of breaks. But the person that owned it was a civilian contractor that taught primary. And this school was owned or operated by a fellow named Tex Rankin, and he was a world's champion aerobatic pilot. And every Sunday when we were off, we got off at noon Saturday, and we were off Saturday afternoon and Sunday, and every weekend he'd had a little Great Lakes, and it had an inverted flight system, inverted oil system, a little biplane. And so he'd get up and do aerobatics. And every Monday, every student he had would get in a Stearman and try to copy it. Now, a Stearman won't run upside down, and we only had 20, 30 hours, but we all tried to do everything he did. And of course you couldn't, because we didn't have any inverted fuel system, or so as soon as you was upside down a few seconds, the engine quit. But anyway, we all got to be good aerobatic pilots, and I think it saved my life in the war, what I learned there 3 separate times in my cruise life. And maybe if you want me to, I can tell you about that when we get to that. But anyway, I went through there, and then they sent me to Bakersfield, California. I flew BT-13s, Volte vibrators, and in primary and basic we flew about, as I remember, about 90 hours. And in basic, we started flying formation. We continued our aerobatics, and we started cross country. And the aerobatics, I was better at it than my instructor was, because I'd gone through Rankin School. But we did cross country, and the cross countries were ridiculous, because 3 months later I could look down and see the whole bloody cross country from one place. They weren't very long, see, but we did learn to navigate and so forth. And every time I was, when I got within 15, 20 miles of the airport, I'd turn the airplane upside down and fly it home upside down and practice turns and stalls and things inverted. And the engine was just windmilling. And what I didn't realize was it didn't have any oil pressure upside down, but it should have. But the sump pump, you see, was now on the top of the engine. They had 220 horsepower Continentals with a sump pump, and the sump was up in the top now. And so once I'd flown about 20 miles upside down, and I rolled it back over, and the engine was, the cylinders were all loaded up that were all that oil on them. So I was just missing it, probably hitting on about 2 cylinders, and the rest of them were, the plugs were all fouled. And boy, I thought I was going to have a real forced landing instead of a practice one, but I got it back to the airport and got it landed in this civilian mechanic. See, this was all civilians that worked there. Even our instructors were civilians. And so when he came up, I told him, boy, this airplane's got a miss in it, and I had trouble getting it back here at the airport. I'll be danged, he said. I wonder what happened to it. And I never did tell him what happened to it. But anyway, that's about the end of my primary. And so we got a choice when we left basic. And so I requested, you didn't always get your request, but I requested to go to twin engine fighters. And I was thinking of P-38s or maybe the old A-20s, because it was the only 2 twin engines we had, and the A-20 was a real light bomber, really. But anyway, so I got assigned to Williams Air Force Base at Chandler, Arizona, and it was a P-38 school. So I was very elated that I got to my first choice. And so I went to there, and we started out in AT-6s, which was a lot like a BT-13, but with, you know it had
one sits right out here right now.
Bigger flaps, and good aerobatic airplane, and kind of hard to land, which was a blessing because you learned not to ground loop. And so anyway, we flew those, and we got about 90 hours there. We flew AT-6s probably most of the time, and then we went into the worst airplane that was ever allowed to fly, and that was a Curtiss, I think it was an AT-9. And there's only one thing, it was very easy to remember. Its top speed, its stalling speed, its takeoff speed, and its stall speed, they were all 120. And so anyway, and on single engine performance, it didn't have any, believe me. But anyway, we flew those about 10 hours. And that was good training. If you lived through the 10 hours in an AT-9, you could fly anything.
How long was your average training flight, Jack?
Oh, if the instructor was with you, it was probably an hour to an hour and a half, and then once you soloed, 4 hours. See, and we flew. What we did, we flew 4 hours in the morning. Then we went to ground school for 4 hours in the afternoon, and then we flew 4 hours at night. Now, we didn't do that in primary, but we did in basic and advanced. So then the next day, well, one day we'd fly mornings, go to ground school in the afternoon, and then fly at night. So we were putting 12 hours a day, and 8 of those hours were in the air, but we'd have a 4-hour ground school in between. Then the next day, we would fly, we'd go to ground school in the morning, we'd fly in the afternoon, and then that night we got to go to bed. So every other night we got a good night's sleep. The nights that we flew in the mornings and then in the evenings, we wouldn't get back maybe till 11 or 12 o'clock, see, so we got a little sleep, but not much. And then after we finished the AT-9s, the English had bought some P-38s, about 50 of them, and they ordered them without superchargers and without counter-rotating props. And they had to tie them down at night because they'd chase cats. They were dogs. And anyway, the English didn't like them, so we used them for advanced trainers. And we got about 10 hours in those, and they were known as P-322s. And they looked just like a P-38, but they had no superchargers, and both props turned in the same direction.
What color were they painted?
Color?
Yeah, do you remember what color they were?
Oh, I don't remember, but it seems to me they were kind of green.
Mm-hmm.
I only flew them 10 hours, see, so I don't, maybe 8 or 10 hours. I don't yeah, they were kind of a greenish color.
I see.
And so anyway, we flew those, and so then we graduated and we got our wings and we became second lieutenants, and so we had a 2 weeks leave, and I went to visit my folks, and when I got back I was assigned as an instructor in AT-6s, and I didn't like that at all, because to be honest about it, the students that we had were, I had maybe 90 more hours than they did. See, I didn't feel very confident being an instructor, and anyway, I was a fighter pilot. I wasn't an instructor. So I was a lieutenant now, so I could speak more clearly with my CO, who was also a lieutenant. And I said, look, I'm a fighter pilot. I'm not an instructor. And he said something very strange to me. He said, Rencher, it wasn't my decision. He said, I got orders to keep you here. And I said, I'll be danged, what did I do? So anyway, I instructed a little bit in AT-6s, and I didn't mind it too bad, but here I'm trying to teach somebody in the front seat, and I'm sitting in the back, and I've got 90, 100 more hours than he had, you see, so I didn't feel very confident. But anyway, I did that, and so my CO called me in one time, and he said, Rencher, I got some good news for you. He said, I'm going to send you to Yuma, Arizona, and you're going to fly gunners in the B-17. And I said, Gad, that's not good news. I said, I'm a fighter pilot. I'm not a 4-engine pilot. He said, I got orders from higher up. He said, it wasn't my decision. So anyway, they sent me to Yuma, Arizona. And I can't tell you on the air what I thought, but I was highly teed off. And so anyway, I get to Yuma, and so the first, after I got there, I don't remember much of anything except my first flight. I'm sitting co-pilot in a B-17. We had 2 gunners, or 2 gunnery instructors, and 22 student gunners who were fresh out of high school, most of them just kids, maybe a year or 2 years younger than I was, but they still looked like kids to me. And we flew 4 hours a day, air to ground gunnery. We'd fly at 150 feet at 150 miles an hour. And we flew a triangle that the legs of the triangle were probably in the vicinity of 20 miles. And then we'd make a 120-degree turn and fly the rest of, we flew a triangle. And so all 22 of those gunners got to shoot at a target on the ground. And they'd paint their bullets in these 50 caliber machine guns. They did it all out of the waist. They didn't use the turrets, so you fired them all from the waist guns. And when they made a hole in the target, why the paint on the outside of the bullet would color the target so they could get a score. And they knew who was shooting by the color of the hole. And so these gunners were very competitive. They wanted a good score. And so we'd do that for 4 hours till all 22 of those kids got to shoot their turn at shooting their ammunition. And then we'd go back in and have lunch, and then we'd go fly air-to-air gunnery. And on air-to-air gunnery, why, we'd fly 9,000 feet, and we'd fly at 150 miles an hour. And they had Martin B-26s, the flying prostitutes. They would fly past us with a tow target at 190 miles an hour. And they'd pull the tow target past us, and the gunners would shoot at that tow target. So we flew 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, so I built up a lot of time. You see, 8 times 6 is nearly 50. So, and then on weekends, when we were, after I got checked out in the B-17s, why, the guys would go to Yuma, and I'd stay there and test fly airplanes or slow time them that hadn't a change in the engine or something. So I flew every weekend. I loved to fly, but I didn't go to town and chase women or drink, see, like the other guys did.
What'd you think about flying the B-17? How was it?
Oh, I learned to love them. It's the best thing that ever happened to me, nearly, other than finding my wife. I loved the airplanes. I really did. And one thing about this air-to-ground gunnery, if you got 22 gunners on board, high school kids with no seats, no seat belts, just kids all over that airplane, and you got to make a 120-degree steep turn, and you're 150 feet above the ground, and the wing sticks down 50 feet, and the cactus stick up 50 feet, you learn not to make turns and not lose any altitude real quick. And the first flight I went on, the pilot, I was the co-pilot, and I'd never had any training in a B-17 at all. So I was training while I was training the gunners. And I guess he had been out on a party, because, boy, we hadn't made but about one lap around this triangle. And he said, all right, you take it now. And so I'd fly straight, and as soon as I'd get to the turn, I'd nudge him and wake him up. And he'd make the turn, and so after about 2 or 3 turns, well, he'd go right back to sleep again. So I finally thought, hell, I can turn this airplane around just as well as he can. So I didn't even wake him up. I just flew the rest of the mission. And when I was turning, he'd wake up and look around and see that I was doing it all right, and he'd go right back to sleep. So anyway, my first mission on it, instead of flying 4 hours, or being co-pilot for 4 hours, why, for about 2.5 of those hours, I flew it while he slept. So anyway, I got through that, and after we got, I don't know, 200 hours or so in the B-17s, I got checked out as first pilot. And then we'd trade back and forth. There'd be 2 first pilots flying or whatever. And but I got so I could fly in either seat. It didn't matter. And so I flew there, and when I got in the vicinity of 1,000 hours in B-17s, and I thought, well, I guess I'm going to sit here the rest of the war, and that's all right with me. I love to fly, and on weekends I'd go test the airplanes on Saturday and Sunday and whatever they wanted me to do. And so they sent me to Salt Lake City, where I was going to be put on a crew. And so I was fine. I had no objection to that. And anyway, usually you were there about a week, and they'd assemble a crew. And the theory was that they'd use psychological tests to get crews that were fit to live with each other, but that was a crock. I don't think they really did that, but that's what they said. But anyway, I was there, and I knew a student nurse that was going to student nurses training there at the hospital in Salt Lake. She was from my hometown in Eager, and she was a friend of my sister's. So anyway, I'd been there about a week, and I was a lieutenant, and I was getting flight pay, although I wasn't flying in Salt Lake, so I had a little money. And so I rented a car, and I took this girl out, and I got acquainted with all of her classmates. And so every day I'd rent a car, and all the student nurses that weren't on duty, I'd get 5 or 6 of them, and we'd go out and have hamburgers or milkshakes or go out to some of their houses. And I had to have them in at 10 o'clock every night, and every morning at 8 o'clock I had to make a roll call. And then every day at noon I had to make a roll call. And that was the only duty I had. And they'd read your name off alphabetically, and you'd holler here. And if they had orders for you, if you had a crew ready, they'd say report to operations. And if they didn't have you on a crew, why, they'd just call the next name. And if they called the next name, you was through to the next roll call. I had no duty, nothing to do. So anyway, I got so that every day, why, I'd make the roll call and in the morning and a roll call at noon, and then I'd go get this rented car and go see the sights or drive around. And when the girls got off duty, I'd pick them up and we'd go out for the evening and have a milkshake or go do something. Never went with one. I took all of them that were off duty, and there'd be 5 or 6 of them, and I got to know them. And these people where I rented the car, it was during the war and cars were scarce, and they found out that I brought the car back and it was clean. It wasn't bunged up or anything, and they had a great big old Lincoln. And they wouldn't rent it to most people, but they rented it to me for the same price as the cheap cars, because they knew when it came back it'd be clean and not dented up or anything. I took good care of it for them. So I rented that car every day. And so a week went by, 2 weeks went by, 3 weeks went by, and everybody is getting called but me. And I wondered what was going on, but I wasn't getting shot at, and I was having a good time with the girls. And although I don't go with the girls much because I was ugly. But anyway, I'd been there maybe a month, and I get a letter from my aunt in this little town of Eager. And she said, "Jack, I hope you're not in trouble." She said, "There's 2 FBI agents in town, and they're just going around town asking questions about you." And I thought, I'll be darned, what have I done? Well, I'll admit I built a few stills for the bootleggers in my younger days, but I never made any whiskey, and the FBI wouldn't have been after me for that. It'd been the revenue agents. And it wasn't against the law to make stills. I was just against the law to use them. And I did demonstrate them to some of my customers, but that was been quite a while ago. So anyway, I didn't worry about it. I thought she might be kidding me, like somebody calls you and say, "This is Internal Revenue calling." And 2 or 3 days later, I get a letter from the high school principal down there, and I knew him real well because he had helped me. I'd gone back to school there a little bit. His name was J.D. Marcel. And he said, "Jack," he said, "I think you're in trouble." He said, "There's 2 FBI agents. They came into my office and they spent all afternoon asking me questions about you. And I didn't know what to tell them, so I just told them the truth." And I thought, boy, he wouldn't be lying to me. Something is wrong. So anyway, a few days later, why, we had a roll call one morning. "Rencher." And I said, "Here." And I thought he'd call Redmond next. He said, "Report to CO at 1300. Well, that was different. You usually reported to operations. So, boy, at 1300, I put on my Class A uniform, and I go into the CO, Lieutenant Rencher, reporting as ordered, sir. And he said, "Sit down, Lieutenant." And said, "I'll be right back." And he left the office, and he came back in with 2 civilians. And the colonel left. And these 2 civilians pulled their wallets out, and they were FBI agents. And now this is a true story. I'm not woofing you a bit. And they said, we have come to investigate, or we have come to ask you to volunteer for an assignment. And you don't have to take this. It's strictly voluntary, and if you don't want to do it, just don't do it, and it'll be no blemish on your record. Well, with just a high school, part high school education, I had no illusions about being a career in the military, because the first thing they do if they're going to promote you, they look at your record, and if you didn't finish high school, they toss it aside. See? And I knew that, so I knew my military career meant nothing. And so anyway, that didn't worry me. But anyway, I said, "Well, what do you want me to volunteer for?" And they said, "We've got a pilot that we don't trust, and we have investigated him thoroughly, and we can't find anything wrong with him, but we don't trust him. And we'd like somebody that's an expert with small arms, that is completely ruthless, that could shoot and kill somebody and not worry about it at night. And he said, we've investigated you thoroughly and you fit our description. And I said, what's the matter with this guy? His uncle is Hermann Göring that headed the Luftwaffe. And we just don't trust him. He was born in the United States, and we can't find anything wrong with him. But I said, but we just want you to go with him and look after him and not let him land in Germany. And I said, all right, if he wants to land in Germany, I'll shoot him and dump him out the window. And they said, no, bring his body back, but don't let him land in Germany, and good luck. So anyway, the next day, Rencher here, report to operations, and I reported to operations, and I'm a first pilot. I've got over 1,000 hours in B-17s. And they introduced me to Warner G. Göring, who had 100 hours in B-17s. And so anyway, we all meet, and I meet Rex Mark, the navigator, and Bill Sackow, the bombardier, and the 6 guys that are gunners. And so we all shake hands with each other, and the next day we get shipped out and go to a place in Texas. Forget the name of it, Dalhart. We went to Dalhart, Texas, and started flying B-17s and training together as a crew. So we trained there a while, and then we went to Savannah, Georgia, and trained there for a while, flew a lot of cross-country. We had navigation flights, we had gunnery flights, and did everything, but we were working together as a crew. And then we went to somewhere, I don't remember where it was, in New Jersey, Trenton, New Jersey, right near New York. And we were supposed to go on up to Maine and pick up a B-17 and fly it to England. And we hung around there 2 or 3 weeks, and they never got us an airplane, so they put us on a ship. It's an English ship called the Aquitania. And we took that, went to England on this ship. And that was an interesting trip, but I won't bore you with that. I'll tell you one thing, the officers had a stateroom, or we did, and there was a latrine. I think the Navy calls it a head, and on the other side of the head was Spike Jones and the City Slickers, and they were going over to a USO show. So we shared the same head with Spike Jones, and so I heard a lot of music on the way over. And there were 16,000 troops on that ship, and they needed about 40 people to watch for submarines, and I got one of the 40 people. So I spent a shift every day on the bridge of this ship, and it was an English ship and an English crew, and I was supposed to watch for submarines. And we went alone because we weren't in a convoy, because this ship was faster than any submarine, and the only way a sub could torpedo us was get in front of us and shoot us as we went by. See, they couldn't catch us. So anyway, I don't know, we'd been out 2 or 3 days, and I spot a submarine. And my job is to report this submarine to the officer, and they had a captain and a first, second, third, and fourth officer, and one of them was always on the bridge. And my position was on the right-hand side of this bridge, and he is 60 feet above the water, I guess. And oftentimes it's so foggy I couldn't see the water. But I was up there watching for subs, and so about the 3rd day out, I spot a submarine right out on the horizon. So I go over and report it to my English officer, and he came and looked at it, and he studied it with binoculars, and I studied it with my binoculars, and he said, I can't figure out why radar hasn't picked it up. He said, maybe it's a whale. So we watched it a while, and pretty soon this submarine spewed. So we knew it was a whale. So anyway, that was the most exciting thing that happened to me on that trip. But anyway, when we got close to the coast, I spot a whole convoy of ships going across ahead of us. And so I report that to my English officer, and he studies them about 10 or 15 minutes, and he said, I think maybe they're the rocks off of certain island, and that's what they turned out to be, some little rocky islands out there. So I didn't really save much on that trip. But anyway, we got to England.
Where'd you land in England?
Where?
Yeah.
You know, I don't remember. I don't remember where we did. It might have been Glasgow, Scotland, but I've been there, but I don't remember where it was. But they sent us to an airport right in the edge of London, and I think it was called Bovingdon, but I'm not sure. But anyway, the little V-1 buzz bombs, they came over all the time, and they just sent the 2 pilots there. Goring and I went there, and the navigator. And the rest of the crew, I think they went to parachute jumping school or something. I don't know where they went. But we were there about 2 weeks, and we learned the English G-box. And I'll tell you, that saved our lives 2 or 3 times. That G-box, that was...
Could you explain what that is?
It was similar to an early model Lorraine, and it told us where you were. They'd set up 3 stations, a master station and 2 slave stations, and then send a signal. And the signal would go to these 2 slave stations and then refer it back to a signal. And by measuring the time it took to get from that station to where you were, told you how far you were from it. It wasn't the directions, it was the distance you were. So if wherever you were, you could draw a circle around that station. And so when you had 2 stations, you'd draw 2 circles. And so there were 2 places where they intersected, but those 2 places were 400 or 500 miles apart. See, so you could judge, you knew within a few hundred miles of where you were. So you knew which cross you were at, and they were precisely accurate. I mean, down to 2 or 3 feet, just amazingly so. And Rex was he's dead now, so I can say this. He was a lousy navigator. He couldn't read a map. He could do celestial navigation, but he couldn't do dead reckoning. We could leave Tampa, Florida to fly up the coast in New York in CAVU weather, clear and visibility unlimited. And you could show him where he was, and in 20 miles he'd be lost. He couldn't follow you along reading the map. So he couldn't, 2 minutes, he couldn't do DR. But anyway, he was good on that G-box. And he's good with celestial, but we never did celestial. See, we didn't fly overseas in the night. So, but anyway, we did learn that, and it was a lifesaver for us a few times in that English fog.
How long were you in England before you got put on station to fly on operations?
I was probably at Bovingdon for 2 weeks, and then I went to the bomb group.
And you were the 303rd Bomb Group?
358th Squadron.
Of the 8th Air Force.
That was luck, because to be honest about it, the 303rd Bomb Group, and somebody's going to get mad at me over this, is probably the best bomb group in the 8th Air Force.
Do you recall what year this was then?
Yeah, I recall. It was in early in 43.
Okay, so 43 was about the time that they started to do the daylight bombing campaign.
I was there at D-Day.
Okay.
See, now I didn't fly in D-Day because we were stood down to strafe the beaches as a last resort.
Okay.
See,
so by D-Day, the daylight bombing campaign was pretty much in full swing.
Oh
at
yes,
this time.
yes, it was going strong. But I didn't fly any missions before D-Day.
Okay, Jack, if you wouldn't mind, if you could, from Bovington, where did you go from there?
From Bovington, we went right direct to the 358th